Listen, thank you so much for coming out to the last River Styx reading of the season featuring Sonya Huber and Robert Wrigley. Before I get going, both authors' books are available through Left Bank Books outside. So when you go and get a drink, just stop by and get a book too. We were just talking earlier about this day and kind of what's going on in Boston. And so it's really, I don't know, it's kind of complicated, right? So I'm going to sort of stick to what I wrote, and then I'll mention something about afterwards, right? I want to welcome you to the final regular season installment of River Styx at the Tavern series. I've got these people in Boston on my mind right now because of the events there, which still I can't really get my head around. It seems like a good time for a literary event. I could use that literary energy and clarity right now that I know that Sonya and Bob will bring. River Styx magazine is thick with writers from Boston, and many have read in this series over the years, so let's send them something good tonight. This has been a big year for River Styx. It's no small thing when a series moves venues after 37 years, right? 37 years in the same place, and that move could have been a disaster. Right. Had it not been for the support of you all, the community of River Styx, and then also the staff, Richard and Shani, and the work that they did, thank you from all of us for supporting us and for helping us make this move. It's been really wonderful. Really wonderful. Thank you. This might be the last River Styx regular season event, but we're going to be repping this summer with the Hungry Young Poets, and that starts in June, every third Monday, just like the regular series. Kelly Allen, who's not here right now, will be the director of that. So if you haven't met her, she's a trip every third Monday. So now a little bit about our first reader, because I know that she has a lot to bring to this conversation. Sonya Huber. It's always a pleasure to introduce nonfiction writers. Because unlike their more insecure brethren writing fiction and poetry, nonfiction writers start from a place of emotional and literal honesty. They tell us the truth of their lives so we might better understand the successes and failures of our own lives. Or maybe better, that we might learn something from the mistakes that they've made or the things that they've seen. Where some poets and fiction writers trade on autobiography while pretending there's a distance created by this mythical speaker, nonfiction writers like Sonya Huber remove the artifice and get right after it. This might be a good time for me to mention that and to give a shout out to Sharon Olds, who definitely brings it without the artifice, who just won the Pulitzer today for Stag's Leap. Not only that, but she was a reader in this series back when it was at Duff's, and she's been in the journal many times too, so we have a connection with Ms. Sharon Olds. Good for her. Even though this was a rough day in other ways, it's nice to see something positive come out of it like that. Nonfiction writers put themselves out there in a way that some other writers cannot or will not. For example, Sonya's last book, Cover Me, a health insurance memoir, it's right here, it's available out there, is a funny and a little too close to home treatise on the healthcare system in the U.S. in the early part of the 21st century. So this is all pre-Affordable Care Act, which was actually something that Sonya, in a different version, advocated for when she lived in Ohio. The book clearly shows the intersection of almost haves and have-nots and the way that our values and expectations directly relate to what we think we should get and who we are as humans and as citizens. It's all, it's all about money, right? But Sonya cuts up the economics and the class and the cultural status in the book elegantly. She's not actually going to read from this book. I didn't know that, so I wrote all that and thinking she was going to read from it. She's actually going to read from another book, Open Nobody. She's got mad game like that. And this is a different kind of book. It's a constructed memoir that's both fiction and nonfiction about her German grandfather, who she never actually met. So it's very interesting. It interrogates familial history, legacy, and ownership. But rather than stepping on the narrative anymore, I'll let her talk about it after I read her bio. Sonya Huber has written 2 books, both of which I just mentioned, and has been the last one, the one she's going to be reading from, Open Nobody, was shortlisted for the Sarion Prize. She's also the author of a textbook, which I just found out. It's called the Backward Research Guide for Writers, which is very cool. She's been published in numerous places, creative nonfiction, Fourth Genre, Passages North, Hotel America, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, which sometimes feels like more like fiction than nonfiction. She teaches at Fairfield University and serves as poetry editor for Dogwood. I know she has some things to say about kind of what happened today, so maybe I'll leave those to her, but please welcome Sonya Huber.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much to Richard and Adrian for having me here. It's an honor to be on the stage at River Styx, where so many writers I admire have stood. Yeah, and thanks out to thanks for the nonfiction shout out. That's awesome. I thought I'm going to read from my first book, Oppa Nobody, but first I'll explain a little bit about what the deal is with this book. Oppa means grandfather in German, and then nobody comes from the fact that my mom didn't really want to talk very much about him, which was weird given the fact that she would drop these offhand comments about how when he was a boy in Germany leading up to the rise of Hitler, he was involved in a militia to fight the Nazis. Or that during World War II, he supposedly ferried anti-Nazi literature in a baby carriage. So I was really, and I've always, as somebody who's always been an activist and involved in my communities, I was always really drawn to this tension. You know, how could someone be a person who sounded really great and yet be a disappointment to his family? And I thought I'd read from this book tonight, partially because it's in paperback, so it's exciting to see the paperback out there. But partially because the central question that really drew me to this project, and that I think draws my writing, is the question, which is really relevant for today, of how do we as people continue to remain engaged with our communities and continue to seek out and support each other even during difficult times. So I started this project really wondering, as an activist in America, wondering how did an activist during the rise of the Third Reich, who was German and opposed the Nazis, how do you get out of bed in the morning, right? And so that's the central question that I was mulling over as I was writing the book. And as Adrian mentioned, it's a mix between fiction and nonfiction. So I do a lot of the nonfiction get out of jail card we use is I imagine, and then we go off into fiction. But because we said I imagine, it still counts. So yeah, that's our trick. You can use it if you want. I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction just to give you, some background. I started this project by collecting family stories. Then I found I needed background about the history of the German social movements. This sent me across to the Atlantic, where I waded through archives and dusty file boxes. Slowly, I felt I was beginning to understand the world in which my grandfather, Heinrich Buschmann Jr., lived. As a writer and a granddaughter, I used this research as my scaffolding. And I used the tool of intuition to listen for my grandfather's voice. My strong desire to know about his life led me out onto a limb, which was in another sense a place I felt most comfortable as a writer, in the scenes of his life as I imagined them. And then I'm going to give a little bit of background, which I think is really important, and because the part of what I can now freely admit is that when I started research on this book in year 2000, 2001, I could, as a graduate student, not have told you the years when World War II started and ended. So I needed some background. And from there, I went to a point of being highly immersed in German history and reading source documents that weren't available in English and German. So I read them slowly. But so I wanted to read just a touch to give you some of what I think is really fascinating background about the history that we don't often hear about. When I researched the period of my grandfather's childhood, I was shocked to discover a rich socialist universe in Germany that existed both before and after World War I. My grandfather grew up in revolutionary times. Bavaria at one point declared itself a socialist Soviet-style republic, and the northwestern industrial Ruhr area of Germany was an autonomous socialist zone, later invaded by the German government. The upheaval and the sense of community ownership of the political process are both almost unimaginable today. For this reason as well, I wanted to allow the reader and myself the chance to step into this world and feel this alternative existence. Within this world, too, are the seeds of the Nazi era. I wanted to wrestle with, if not understand, some of the causes of the Nazi horrors. So I'm going to read a little bit of what drew me to these stories before I even knew that there were any stories to investigate. Heine, my grandfather, ate out of the garbage. This might have been the first thing I heard about my grandfather when I was a child, well before I understood the Second World War. As a child, I imagined him striding across a map, finding garbage to eat as a sort of Easter egg hunt along a board game map with squares blocked out to mark his progress. He and his iron stomach returned. He fathered my mother, and then he died, and then I was born to imagine him eating those curled ribbons, to fear the malignancy of half-turned potatoes. Before I was born, my mother was a child with my face. She learned to eat. A slice of bread spread thick with lard was a delicacy, and even more so if it glistened with dark bits of cooked fat. At this strange table of her stories, no one ate until the father picked up his spoon. Bones were grabbed and sucked clean of marrow, and a soup was made from the blood of a goose that was stuck in the skull with a knitting needle and drained. The fatty gristle on a piece of meat was chewed like a luscious wad of bubble gum. That was the table where one's value as a kitchen goddess was proven by her skill at wielding a knife, the ability to slice bread so thin that sunlight showed through its porous surface. After the war, Mom remembers that Heine once went to the trash heap to rescue a jar of rotten pears. Alarmed at the waste, compelled, he peeled off the mold with a knife and ate them, risking bacteria and death to appease the god of hunger. I tasted history first through the way my mother ate, attacking the shiny leavings of meat on our plates, frying every bit of spare egg and flour breading after the pork chops were cooked, treasuring the burnt schmaltz that remained in the frying pan after the meat and potatoes were served. I didn't like rubbery fat. I gagged on the gristle of steak, repulsed at the way tough meat dragged against my tongue, determined to outlast any attack. "Why do you eat like that?" I asked Mom, and she invoked the praise song of meat ends and discarded bits. My mother, transplanted from Europe, will drive an hour through the maze of shiny Midwestern strip malls to buy a decent loaf of bread, the kind with a surface lined and creased like a face. When she pays for a dense loaf, she holds it in her arms as if it were a child, cradling it, feeling the living heft of it. It can't have ever been touched by plastic, she says, because that suffocates the dough. Bread is my religion, she says. The Jewish man Rolf Abramson knew the other side to this faith. After surviving the circuit through the Nazi death camps, he arrived in Bochum in the fall of 1944. Bochum is a town near where my family is from in northwest Germany. He was assigned to work in a grenade factory in the same waning months as Heine limped in the east. After the bombs lit the air of the Ruhr, the Nazis forced Rolf and the other prisoners to find the undetonated bombs. He poked through dusty rubble with a broomstick. When he discovered a bomb's metallic hull, he nudged it. If the world did not vanish in a flash of hot light, he earned a piece of bread. Okay. Now I actually I'm going to go back and read a bit from the beginning. Although the project was born for me in hearing these inexplicable stories of my grandfather and the war, always the war, the immediate impetus for the project came from when I was around 30. I was working as a labor activist in Chicago, and at the time, my mom had gone to a funeral in Germany, and she came back with news that she basically heard, she said, your great-grandfather hung a red flag from a mountainside. And she asked a few more questions for clarification, and it became clear through collecting stories and phone calls that she might have been wrong about the fact that her side of the family hadn't done anything important. They had been very involved in organizing coal miners. So that got me curious. And I was also getting really drained with the activist life. So that was the first real practical impulse for me, was like I wanted mentors, even if they were dead. So this is sort of the rant that starts the book. Why try to change the world? Dear Opa, grandfather, Heine Bushman, I knelt down in the reference section of a Midwestern American library, beat-tired, already late for another damn political meeting at a cheap Chinese restaurant. I tried to conjure you from a volume on German history. Come on, socialist, anti-Nazi, German, man I've never met. Appear and tell me how to live without fear. Lifelong activist reads so cool in the history books, but the family hardly mentions your name now, so bitter toward the man with the agendas and the pamphlets stuffed in his pockets, the distracted look on his round, sleepy face. You were no inspiration to me as I grew up in a Republican small town, a south side of Chicago mall rat turned shaved-head anarchist. I didn't even know your stories. But then I seemed to turn weird and angry, as if an underground tide pulled my blood in that direction. But we don't believe in those blood stories, do we, Opa? There's no answer. I know a few stories, where they lived, the coal mines, the organizing, the sickness, the political turmoil. And so I imagine his beginnings, the seed of him. Heine, you may have opened your mouth to cry, but your chest folded like a wad of paper and wouldn't release. Heine let out a thin noise between his teeth. His mother, Lena, bent down over a pregnant belly and reached for Heine and the blankets. The child's face was red and flushed. Verdammte, she said, damn it all. She wiped Heine's nose and saw in the handkerchief the green of wild infection, flecked with the black dust that coated their lungs, their apartments, and their lives. No wonder the babies died. My great-grandmother Lena, a fiery woman with black hair and dark eyes, takes the name the dragon in family lore, der Drache, repeated with a solemn shiver. At the time of her birth in 1880, the newly formed country of Germany had outlawed socialism. In 1898, not even 20, She fled her home. Fled why? What drew her and what chased her? And moved 300 miles from Germany's southeast to the northwestern city of Köln, a bold step for a working-class girl. She found work as a maid with a colonel in the Reich military. She met my grandfather, Heinrich Sr., a young stable hand who was already launching his grand career of rabble-rousing and getting fired. I can taste this much from the intuition of history. Lena ran, the way we dark-haired, nervous, stunned, and skittish women of our clan do, and she found a man with sun in his eyes and the laughing confidence that revolution and a better life were right around the corner. She married Heinrich Sr. on October 25th, 1900, in a cloud of disapproval. A Lutheran girl marrying a Catholic, a runaway marrying a socialist wild man. The year after their wedding, Lena's strong man went down in the mines, which exploded and flooded and smashed men's hands and feet and took their lives and didn't pay nearly enough. The miners stood shouting on the picket lines and strikes, spread like brush fires from one mine to the next in 1872, 89, 90, 91, 93. Heinrich Sr. learned the trade of riling up a crowd as he dug black hunks of coal. As a child, I knew none of this, had been told only that he could bounce knives by their points on his biceps and that he ate raw onions. I'd imagined him as a weird German clown standing up at Thanksgiving to grab the carving knives and marching around the table in a tank top with muscles bulging like Popeye, an onion in his mouth and his eyes streaming happy tears. I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we'll take a short break and we'll be right back with poet Robert Wrigley. Robert Wrigley, speaking of Illinois writers from coal mining families in Illinois, is often thought of as a nature poet, usually associated with rural western landscapes. And when he writes about the natural world, he does so without being nostalgic or boring or sentimental or spiritual. In his own words, Robert Wrigley aims to, quote, tell the truth but make it sing, or tell all the truth but make it sing, cutting finely wrought gems through which we can look at not only the natural world, but a world full of much strangeness and wonder, from Descartes' lost daughter to King Kong and Rush Limbaugh.
Sorry.
You can groan. I think we're all among socialists here. Robert Wrigley is the author of 9 poetry collections, most recently Anatomy of Melancholy and Other Poems, which Penguin just put out a couple weeks ago, so I knew I haven't even had a chance to look at it yet, and also Beautiful Country, also from Penguin 2010. A recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and 2 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships, Wrigley is a professor of English at the University of Idaho. Though he has lived in the northwestern United States for more than 3 decades, Wrigley was born in East St. Louis, was raised in Collinsville, where his parents still lived, was drafted in 1971 but discharged as a conscientious objector, and earned his BA from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. He bought his first book of poetry from St. Louis's Left Bank Books, and he remains, quote, a very serious Cards fan. And the fact that we currently seem to have no closer is serious indeed. I was at that game where the closer just blew it again. Wrigley lives with his, that's why I got this sunburn right here, cardinal red on my face. Wrigley lives with his wife, the writer Kim Barnes, and their children on the Clearwater River in Idaho. He has taught at Lewis Clark College at the University of Oregon, twice at the University of Montana, where he returned to hold the Richard Hugo Chair in Poetry, and at Warren College. He is the director of the MFA program in creative writing at the University of Idaho. Please welcome to our podium, Robert Wrigley.
I love a venue where you can bring your scotch to the podium. It's great to be here. The River Styx reading series. I've known about it for a long time, but I've lived, in Idaho and Montana and Oregon and Washington for, I'm terrible with math. Well over 30-some years anyway. But I've known about this series and have always thought, gee, it would be great to be invited to be part of that. And I'm very grateful to have been invited, and I'm very glad to be part of it now. And it's a great pleasure to read with Sonya Huber. Thanks to Adrian, to Richard, to Shaney, to my old friend Glenn from still lives in Collinsville, who picked me up at my parents' house, brought me over in his extremely hot little Volkswagen. I thought, well, the 75 miles an hour on the 25 mile an hour approach ramp was just a little much for me. I messed myself a little. I drooled. I'm going to read. I've been trying to decide what to read. I've got a whole list of poems. And I thought that I would read a poem not from this brand new book, available at booksellers everywhere, including Left Bank Books, right through the door. But this book, which is even newer, this is a British edition of a new book of selected poems. And I find that I like it a lot, which is like saying I like my son a lot or something. But I thought I'd read one poem from, I guess you would call it the archives. I don't live in the canyon of the Clearwater River anymore. About 12 years ago, I moved up to the mountains. The canyon of the Clearwater River is low. It never snows. It's a spectacular mountain river. Now I live up in the mountains, in the trees, in the forest, and it snows. The only months I have not seen snow at my house on Moscow Mountain are August and September's been kind of iffy. And the wind blows a lot. And we have bears and wolves and moose and coyotes and cougars and wind. I like the wind. We are at or near that approximate line where a stiff breeze becomes or lapses from a considerable wind, and I like it here. The chimney smokes right-angled from west to east, but still, for those brief, intact stretches of them, the plush animal tales of fires. I like how the stiffness rouses the birds right up until what's considerable sends them to shelter. I like how the afternoon's rain, having wakened the soil's raw materials, has sent a root smell into the air around us, and which the pine trees sway stately within. I like how the sun strains not to go down, how the horizon tugs gently at it, and how the distant grain elevator's shadow ripples over the stubble of the field. I like the bird feeder's slant and the dribble of its seeds. I like the cat's sleepiness as the breeze, then the wind, then the breeze keeps combing her fur. I like the body of the mouse at her feet. I like the way the apple core I tossed away has browned so quickly. It is much to be admired, as is the way the doe extends her elegant neck in its direction and the workings of her black nostrils too. I like the sound of the southbound truck blowing by, headed east. I like the fact that the dog is not barking. I like the arc of the house afloat on the sea of March and the swells of the crop hills bedizened with sedillas of old snow. I like old snow. I like my lungs and their conversion to the gospel of spring. I like the wing of the magpie outheld as he probes beneath it for fleas or lice. That's especially nice. The last sun pinkening his under feathers as it also pinks the dark when I close my eyes, which I like to do in the face of it, this stiff breeze that was, when I closed them, a considerable wind. So this new book has a stolen title. It's called Anatomy of Melancholy and Other Poems. The original Anatomy of Melancholy was published in 1621 in England by one Robert Burton. Robert Burton was trained as a mathematician, but he was a 17th century polymath. His version, The Anatomy of Melancholy, is 1,500 pages long. If you are fluent in Latin, it reads a lot quicker because every paragraph has Latin in it. The New York Review Books has a new edition of it out with translations at the bottom of the page, eminently worth having. And if you're in your 40s and you get it now and you live to a ripe old age, you'll get through it. Burton's subtitle, I don't have a subtitle, unless it's And Other Poems. Burton's subtitle is What It Is, that is Anatomy of Melancholy, or Melancholy. What it is, with all the kinds, causes, symptoms, prognostics, and several cures of it. Basically, Burton believed that melancholy was the very condition of what it means to be human, and I agree. If you've never been melancholy, the reasons for it are one of two. You are either extremely lucky or dumb as a shovel. This is also probably, I think, my most elusive book. Many of the poems refer to other works of literature. This one refers to two works of literature. If I had a 10-book Desert Island list, this book would be on it. This author would be on it for sure. Usually they only give you 5, in which case, sorry, you're not on it. But if I had 10, this guy would be on it. And it's a book called Modern English Usage. You guys know, any of you know that book? Oh, it's a wonderful book. You can buy it at used bookstores for like $2 in hardcover with the desk jacket on it. Nobody wants it anymore. It's all online. But H.W. Fowler's, Henry Watson Fowler's Modern English Usage is a wonderful book because he's so cranky. He figures into this poem, and also figuring into this poem is a 19th century, wonderful 19th century Jesuit priest and British poet by the name of Gerard Manley Hopkins, particularly a poem of his called Pied Beauty, the opening line of which is, "Glory be to God for dappled things." Every now and then a poet uses a word and completely ruins it for everybody else. This poem is called First Person. One lies on one's back in the woods, savoring the sun, and for some reason one has opted for what Fowler calls the false first-person pronoun, one, that is, over the other. One brushes an ant from one's ear. One peers up into the breeze-swayed branches of a ponderosa pine. One among many, one has arranged oneself under. Perhaps the wind, which is easy and warm, dislodged the ant one swept from one's ear, meaning it had fallen many times its height to land there in the whirl of the ear of one. In truth, one wishes for the tongue of a sylph instead of an ant. Even two sylphs, one thinks, though perhaps it is not sylphs one means, they being invisible spirits of the air, but rather the slender girls of one's conjuring. One conjures, one admits. Thinking one dead, a deer approaches. One imagines being a deer. But then one rises to a seated position so that the deer will startle and run. If only one could run as a deer does. If one were not so weary, one would that very deer chase a ways, beguiled by the wave of its white tail. But no, one is molten. One seems to have no bones. One shall not run, not now, nor even rise. Instead, one shall subside to one's supine pose, and by the sun, through the needles of the trees, be dappled. Though, of course, one should avoid the word dappled. One knows this. Yet something about the sun and the sway of the shadows makes one larcenous as well as slothful. And as one acknowledges one's Hopkinsian trespass, one notes perhaps the same sort of finch spoken of in his poem, and sees one's borrowing as praise of the finch, that is, although it dawns on one that this particular finch is an American goldfinch, and one decides one's praise is for him instead, the poet. One feels literary and elusive then. It seems one's time upon one's back in the woods is not wasted after all. There is the squeegee, 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 squeegee song of the goldfinch. One is delighted by the 19 E's in the preceding line, not one of which has been written since one is reclined under the trees with none of the usual writing implements. One counts them in one's head and upon one's fingers instead. One's 1965 Book of the Month Club edition of Fowler's Modern Usage delights one also, though it is a quarter-mile away and stamped with the name and address of a dead woman one knew once. One knew her, and she died, and one is glad to have known her, for she was droll and brilliant, although one wishes one had known her when she was young. Once one was young, but is no longer, though one still conjures as if one were. Sylphs, women, the too soon dead, the chaste and priestly poets of yore. Otherwise, one does not imagine one is certain of much. In fact, one is almost asleep, but then a hawk alights on the limb directly above a rabbit in its talons. One's breath is held. One perceives the soul of the rabbit does not abide. One dares not move, even though one's face and white t-shirt will soon be dappled with the rabbit's blood. One imagines, one thinks of the one one loves and knows that she will startle to see one's bloody face and shirt. One will stand seemingly wounded and speak to her of wind and sun, the hawk and its prey, the finch and the deer, even fowler, all things whose beauty is past change. And the one one loves will not understand at first when one insists that one must never be the last one to die. I'm just going to read a few and let you get back to wine and conversation. My parents do still live in Collinsville, Illinois. My father is 91. He'll be on Thursday. I'll be here Thursday for his 91st birthday. He was, just after his, I think, 82nd birthday, diagnosed with Parkinson's. If anybody hands you a list of diseases to choose from that you will be diagnosed with in your 80s, don't pick Parkinson's. Pick venereal disease. Something sexually transmitted. Sure, would have to be a lot, and recently transmitted. That's all I could. It is a terrible disease. He can no longer converse. He was a woodworker. He made roll-top desks. He once built a harpsichord. And he can't do anything anymore. This is a poem called Cenotaph, which is a word that migrated into English from Greek, kenos meaning empty, and taphos meaning tomb. Cenotaph. Never especially inclined mathematically, my father, days past his 80th birthday, calculated the following. If the names of all the dead, military and civilian alike, of every nationality from his war, the good one, were blasted into granite, as were those of only the American soldiers who had perished in the bad one, mine, The resulting monument would be almost a mile long and 100 feet deep. Setting aside the engineering challenges, he believed the greater problem was the names. 60 million, he ciphered, though I don't know how. His imagined monument, a project no greater than the interstate highway system or the dams across the nation's rivers, could take decades to erect, no more than Rushmore or Crazy Horse, and yet who would have envisioned such a task? I remember how the night of the first moon landing, he stood in his backyard in the heart of the country, straining through binoculars to see what could not be seen but was. Now, 10 years past his monumental calculations, the only numeral that matters to him is 2. We are not sure why. Perhaps because my sister and I are 2, as are he and our mother, her failing eyes and gentle hands. And therefore, 2 is the answer to every problem the young neurologist poses, a physician not much older than my own children, none of whom ever lived through something called the draft. My father does not know what year we are in or the name of our current president. Even the names of his grandchildren are lost to him sometimes. And if we were to ask that name by which he calls himself, we fear that too may be gone. He does not know, and probably never did, the word cenotaph, though the memorial he once imagined would have been just that, an empty tomb. Father, let me estimate the dead for you. It has been and will be everyone. Let us understand that mountains are, like plains and swamps, like rivers and oceans, death and life factories, forges from which come numberless souls, residents on a spinning blue cenotaph that without us has no name nor need of one. These were the dead of a single war, these the dead of the others. And here are those who died, as we say, in peace, some whose lives have faded within them until there are only the names and numbers they had been known by. And here is where they were, beneath a cyclical moon, which bears through the universe some footprints and a flag. 2 more. It's the 2-poem warning. I never read this poem in public before. So if it does not work, I'll know, I guess. Anyway, I decided to read it, one, because of what Sonya was reading, but also because I realized that it was my friend Glenn, indirectly, he may not remember how this happened, but I'll explain it to him later, who actually gave me this poem when I was a child. The poem's called Socialists. There's a young woman in the poem who goes by the name K.O., which of course means knockout, but her father called her K.O. because he named her after Kate Richards O'Hare, who's a famous American Socialist Party activist. She was imprisoned during World War I. It also refers to Eugene V. Debs. In fact, Eugene V. Debs I stole the last line from him. And I don't think you need to know anything else about that. It's called Socialists. I write a lot of summer job poems. I had a lot of odd summer jobs. Because he paid me union scale, I loved Christ Schuler and monkeyed iron and copper water pipes with his daughter, Katie O'Hare. K.O. he called her, and she was that, although she also liked to fight, not wrestle, which, when I could get a hold of her, we would, but punch, kick, gouge, and bite. I mooned over her teeth marks on my right shoulder for hours one night, But no matter how I contrived to contort my neck and stretch out my tongue, I could not lick them as I wished, nor her, neither pugilistically speaking or otherwise. You keep that pipe of yours away from my daughter, or I'll torque the thing clean off with this wrench, Christ said, brandishing a 14-inch quick fit my way. Then he laughed. She's a sweet dumpling, ain't she? On the door of his truck, Christ's plumbing, just like Jesus would do. The tailgate and bumper festooned with stickers extolling the wisdom of Eugene V. Debs, Norman Thomas, Albert Einstein, and Woody Guthrie. K.O.'s hair's as red as America'll be someday, he said. In every crawl space or basement, in some hidden spot no owner or landlord would ever be likely to see, he scrawled with a grease paint pen the same slogan: when the people shall have nothing more to eat, they will eat the rich. And though I knew he meant the moneyed ones whose places we worked on, I confess the line's Rousseauvian prognostication was lost on me. All I wanted was to eat his sweet dumpling up. She taunted me as we hefted 8-foot iron sewer pipes, debating the vileness of capitalist shit. And as she was indoctrinated by Christ, so by she was I. Come July, I'd have made an incision in the gut of any plutocrat she'd aimed me toward, pulled loose a loop of intestine, and fed it to a hungry dog for her. And if she believed my conversion was not quite true, it was Christ himself who convinced her otherwise, saying over lunch his admiration for my grandfather, an international worker of the world and doomed unionist coal miner dying even then of black lung. In the face of his praise, I looked at K.O. and she was smiling. Which was how it came to be. We came to be naked in the crawl space of a seedy complex of subsidized housing some shyster city father was paying us to plumb on the cheap. The freckles on her chest ended where the sun never shined, but I counted every one like a vote and felt as though it were not only Christ I was betraying, but somehow my grandfather too, believing the things she'd told me for reasons having little to do with the downtrodden masses, but that rather right before my eyes was her pale, unfreckled, and delectable ass, as she fed a length of second-rate copper water pipe up a hole between the floor joists and wiggled at me, then giggled. She'd be almost as old as I am today if she had not vanished one morning on the way to school. They found her stripped, bound in baling twine, face up in a pond on the outskirts of town. Christ retired then and died a few years later. My grandmother insisted of a broken heart. Katie O'Hare of the red hair, of the wedge of neckline and shoulder freckles, daughter of Christ, I loved you too, girl. The general theory was you were too beautiful for an unknown monster to resist. The lesser thought was fascists or some Midwestern right-wing anti-communist self-appointed death squad come to avenge your father's un-American tailgate philosophy. Forgive me if I find this latter take unlikely. But you should know that among the pipes and faucets, the toilets and showers of my hanging by its fingertips, middle-class, mostly mortgaged American home, I do not see or hear the water issue forth or vanish without some thought of you or of your father. He would not recognize the nation of your birth. You fought hard, I'm sure, but your father had no country to fight for, only the earth. He was as you were, as I may be myself someday, a citizen of the world. I'm sort of going to lighten up. The book's called Anatomy of Melancholy, for Christ's sake. I'm going to sort of lighten up with the last poem. This one is also very elusive to the extent that there is a great canonized poem in the English canon by a crazy man by the name of Christopher Smart called Jubilate Anno, which means rejoice in the Lamb. The most famous part of that poem is the chunk that gets anthologized all the time. It's about his cat. We were all interested in God and Jesus and stuff, but it's the cat. It's still the same thing. Now, what's the name of that book that's the bestseller? I Could Pee on This. It's spoken by a cat. Seriously, what the fuck? How can that be? How can that book be selling so many copies? What? So I gave in. I wrote a cat poem. Smart's was For I Will Consider My Cat Jeffrey. Mine is For I Will Consider My Cat Lenore. Thank you very much for being a wonderful audience. For she has in this her 12th year of hunting lost some weight in the summer, despite the daily, even hourly slaughter of everything smaller than she and unable to escape her. For she had for some time, unbeknownst to me, relieved herself on my favorite dress shoes, making them foul and fit only for the fire. For though she be named after the place she was born, as long as such legions as she requires might be dispatched and often devoured in whole or part, she is happy to be here or there, it hardly matters otherwise. For she does not like me, and I know not why. And offer her each morning a tablespoon of cream, which she will deign to lap a bit, then abandon to the dog. For there is her purr in the lap of my daughter, whose cat she was. And there is her purr in the laps of my sons and my friends, though her purr in the lap of he who offers her cream worth never. For the practical worth of her depredations is the ratio by which those preyed upon enter not the house. For the house is in the woods, and the woods are also full of those whose depredations upon her are as avidly sought as hers upon her prey. For she is luckier than her mother and brother, gotten by owl, coyotes, or eagle, or perhaps even one of those of the same order as she, bobcat, lion, or lynx. For she is gray and invisible, it seems. For she cougheth up elaborate balls of her own fur upon the carpet for me. For I have labored to love her, and have accomplished by such labors an understanding at least, since I have watched her at the hunt and been inspired by the single-mindedness and excellence of her predatory disposition. For I have also wondered what manner of attentiveness of my own I might have brought to bear upon anything that could equal hers, unless it be praise. For the sun and the moon, for the plenitude of mice, and for the still, beautiful back of the hummingbird she has left in the ashtray next to the chair on the porch of my shack. For it is a calliope hummingbird smaller than my little finger, and its purple cowl, in the time I have attended to this consideration of its killer, has, without my notice, faded, and Lenore herself has uncoiled from the chair where she had slept for more than an hour and walked back into the woods, to which I will toss the hummingbird's almost weightless body, which she left me, so that I might feel exactly the way I do right now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we've been offering this Q&A session at the end of our reading, and I know a lot of people have questions for our writers, but I was going to kick off with one to both of you. as a nonfiction writer and as a poet, when is it permissible to lie, and why, and does it feel dishonest or does it feel good? So.
Never, always. It's maybe more complicated than that.
I imagine.
Maybe not. I don't know.
No, I don't think it is.
You did the I imagine thing. I kind of latched onto that.
Yeah, that's not lying, right? That's saying I'm going to lie. I hope you enjoy it. We'll talk at the end, right?
That's
So
good. It just means I'm going to try to tell the truth as I imagined it might have occurred. And you can all do that. I mean, we do that all the time.
Okay.
When things happen where we were not present and where no one who might have been present is alive, right? What else can you do?
And I think also, I mean, this reminds me of one of my favorite nonfiction writers. His name is Scott Russell Sanders. He's from Indiana. And he wrote 2 essays at a distance of maybe 20 years from each other, both about the death of his father, with 2 radically different points of awareness about what his father's life and death meant, right? So then I think they mean different things, but neither of them is really necessarily a lie. One just had less insight.
Right. Perspective changes. Although with poetry, I do have to say all my poems are based on personal experience, whether I've had it or not. I'm serious.
Are there more questions? Really? I've talked to several people that had questions. Okay,
Robert Wrigley, I would like to hear about your reading style, which I was very taken with, and if this is just a natural way that you write and hear your voice, or if this is something that has been influenced by certain people or different times or anything like that.
I studied with Richard Hugo, who studied with Theodor Retke, and you can look up Theodor Retke on YouTube, and it's both wonderful to watch Retke read and excruciating. Let's see. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy. But I hung on like death. It's a combination of Stanley Kunitz and W.C. Fields. Right, exactly. Which, if nothing else, taught me how I don't want to do that. Because, I mean, the poem I just started to recite in sort of Retke's probably drunken and vaunted way of delivering a poem is a wonderful poem. It's called My Papa's Waltz. It's a wonderfully ambiguous poem that may be about, a lot of people think, oh, it's about a terrible alcoholic, abusive father, but that's bullshit. It's not about that. It's about a child with this immense love for a father who works all the time and who clings to him in any way he can, including when he's drunk and comes home and they dance around the kitchen and demolish the kitchen while mother looks on frowning. How did I get on that from this? I think it's in the rhythms. I mean, I have a separate building from the house. I can't write in the house because, as my wife says, I moan when I write, and I can tell you I look like Stevie Wonder when I write. I'm doing this because even if the poems are rhetorical and highly syntactically various, if they don't have that kind of immediate rhythm for me, that I'm not interested in them. I get bored, and all I really feel like I'm doing is delivering them the way they live on the page.
At what point in the process do you moan?
Through it.
Usually at the end.
No, it's a sigh.
Was there another question? Nope. Okay. You're dismissed.
We're dismissed.
Okay, so our next reading will kick off our Hungry Young Poets series on July the 17th, June 17th. I can do my bifocals strengthen one more notch. June 17th, which is the third Monday of June, so hopefully we'll see you then. Thanks to the Tavern for letting us do this for 1 year. It's nice to have a new home and be like here. Yeah, thanks again to our readers, and thanks to Missouri Humanities Council and also Missouri Arts Council for letting us do this, and congrats to podcast this as well. And last of all, thanks to you for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next month.